Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Each In His Grip message is designed to help turn our hearts toward Jesus and equip us to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Midwives of the Messiah.
His death was sudden, and his death was rare. Now Tamar is left childless. There is no one to carry on the legacy. She is now a widow. And here is where the story takes an interesting twist. Verse 8. Then, on the heels of Er's death, then Judah said to Onan, this is the second son, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. Tamar was given the second son in marriage. The second son in marriage was given to her by her father-in-law. And so Onan is to assume the responsibilities maritally and produce children with Tamar, who would then become the legacy, the heritage of the first brother, whom God killed. By this marriage, her offspring, if they had any children in this second marriage, those children would bear the name of the first father, the first husband, I should say, They would become legally his offspring, and they would be legally the ones who would receive the inheritance that came from In Deuteronomy chapter 25, we are told this is called the law of the Levirate. The law of the Levirate was for the purpose of protecting women whose husbands died early in the marital relationship, or women who became young widows. It was the responsibility of the husband's brother to assume the marital relationship so that she could bear children and carry those children on so that the heritage and lineage of the dead person could be extended. Onan stepped in. He didn't mind having intercourse with her, but because any firstborn child would be the legal heirs of and not of Onan, and would carry on name and not Onan's name, verse 10 tells us that he refused to impregnate her. And verse 10 makes this incredible statement: what he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Now, you would probably have figured out by now as you're reading this story, God has a very special plan for this family, Judah. And he's not taking too kindly to the way in which the people involved in this play are acting. Now God has not only killed God has now killed Onan. Both of them he refers to as wicked men. Parenthetically, I want you to think about something. If Onan had listened to his father, if Onan was more concerned about the lineage of Messiah than he was about his own pocketbook, Onan could very well have become the one blessed of God to carry on the lineage of Messiah. But he chose the material blessings and missed the deeper spiritual blessings God had in course for him. It is of critical importance that we don't cross over or miss or pass over one little detail in this verse. I want you to go back to verse 10, where it says, what he did was wicked in the Lord's sight. Underline the word Lord there. As you may or may not know, there are several words in the scripture that refer to God. One of those words is Elohim. Elohim means, it's kind of a general word. It's kind of a generic term that describes God. A Jewish person would hear that word and he would think about who his God was. But for the rest of the world, Elohim could have meant anything. It could have meant any kind of a God. And all the way through this story thus far, when it refers to God as Elohim. But in this particular verse, the word is changed. The word now becomes Yahweh, the name of the covenant God, the name we would not really learn too much about until Moses, many years later, when Moses would stand before the burning bush and say, "Who is it that's sending me? Let me tell them what your name is." And he says, "Tell them my name is Yahweh. I am that I am." Now, for Jewish history, it became important for them to understand the significance when that name was used. Because for Jews, historically, the name Yahweh is equated with the name of the God of the covenant. That God is building a family. That family would extend from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, all the way through Moses and David, and all the way down through the prophets, and eventually into the line of Messiah himself. That name, Yahweh, that covenant name, is a critical ingredient in understanding why God's killing people in these verses. Because you see, what was at stake here was the covenant. What was at stake here was the lineage of Messiah. What was at stake here was the promise of God. And these men didn't get it, and so God killed them. Now, I don't know why Judah would now do what he was going to do, but I would imagine that now that two sons married to this woman have died, he would conclude that Tamar was what we would call a black widow, that she was somebody you wanted to stay away from. In fact, there was an ancient superstition prevalent in his day. We read about it in the apocryphal book of Tobit, which refers to a woman whose husband dies, and then another marries her, and that person dies, and refers to that person superstitiously as someone you really want to stay away from. Maybe Judah bought into that superstition. Maybe he was afraid of what was going to happen to his youngest child. Maybe he feared God. We're not sure, but we do know, as verse 11 unfolds, we read what Judah decided to do now that is dead and Onan is dead. He says in verse 11, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, notice she's still called his daughter-in-law because legally she was. When married Tamar, Tamar became a part of the family until her death. Judah held absolute rights over Tamar. He could decide her fate just like that. And so now she's a widow once, she's a widow twice. It comes to the third son, who's probably no more than 7 or 8 years old. And he says to Tamar, live as a widow. Literally, by the way, those words mean live lonely and forsaken. Imagine that. Live lonely and forsaken. Live as a widow in your father's house. Let him take care of you. Until my son Shelah, that's the third boy, grows up. For he thought. Now, he said one thing, but he thought another thing. He's telling Tamar, wait until Shelah grows up. Now, if you were Tamar, what would you have concluded from that? When Tamar grows up, he will become my husband. And from him, I can procreate children and extend this line. That's what he told her. But he thought, the Bible tells us, he may die too, just like his brothers. That's the superstition coming in. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Implied in that statement of what Judah was thinking he had absolutely no intentions of ever giving Tamar Shelah. He was in no way, shape, or form ever going to commit his third son. Two were already dead in his mind because of this woman. He was not going to give the third son to this woman. So in order to cover himself, at least publicly, in terms of his reputation, he says, you need to go home and you need to live lonely and forsaken as a widow. She could never marry unless Judah told her so. You live as a widow until Shelah grows up, never intending ever to give Shelah to Tamar. Now, this is a man who seems to have no regard for his extended legacy. This is a man who is playing games with the promises of God. It stands to reason. A, he's young and immature. B, he's just sold his brother into slavery. He's watched two sons die. Here is a man whose life is, for all intents and purposes, all messed up. So he sends her away. But the soap opera continues as the scene now shifts to the land of Canaan sometime later, verse 12. It says, after a long time. Now, we're not told exactly how long that is, but the implication of the verse is now Shelah is grown up. Tamar is still living as a widow, but Tamar is of age, it appears. The daughter of Shua died. That's Judah's wife. Now, he's a widower. Two sons are dead, and he's a widower. Tamar is still living with her father in Adullam. Shelah is all grown up, and it says, when Judah had recovered from his grief, and a grieving period was normally a year or 2 years, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing sheep. He and his friend Hira. Hira's still in the picture years later. This Adullamite, this Canaanite, this apparently bad influence in Judah's life. So he takes off his grieving clothes and he looks to go to a party. A real party. The man is going to celebrate. He's going to take his sheep up to the party in Adullam, a festive occasion where all the shepherds would bring their sheep in to have their sheep sheared, to sell their sheep to the marketplace, their goods to the marketplace, and they would hold a great big Mardi Gras. That's what it was. In fact, it was a 100% sexual celebration and party to the goddess called Astarte. They went there specifically on sheep shearing day to have their own version of Mardi Gras and to have a sexual experience with all of the sacred prostitutes that would lay in wait, so to speak. And it was considered to be a culturally acceptable thing, and in fact, with the prostitutes, an honorable profession to be a sacred prostitute of Astarte. And so from all over the place, the shepherds would come. They would sell their sheep goods, and then they would look for the nearest prostitute. And they would celebrate to the goddess Astarte. Point being, Judah knew full well where he was going, and he knew full well what he was planning on doing. Why should I mourn anymore? It's been a long time since I've had an intimate relationship with a woman. It's time for me to think about me. It's time for me to fulfill my desires and my wants. After all, I've buried 2 sons, and I've seen so much tragedy come into my life. It's time for me to pay respects to me. So he takes his, quote, business trip to Canaan. He determined that his time of mourning was over and that he would join the party. Little did he know what was waiting for him in the wings. Look at verse 13. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law," notice he's still her father-in-law, "your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep." And I'll insert in there, "and to do some other things." She took off her widow's clothes. You understand culturally what that verse is telling you? For years now, this woman has been wearing the widow's clothes, which means hands off. She's lonely and she's forsaken. She's someone else's property. She's not to be touched. Covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Anahim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, that's the third son, she had not been given to him as his wife. The boy's a man. You made a promise. Where's the promise? Verse 15. When Judah saw her, interesting word there, by the way, for saw, fixed his gaze on her. Wasn't just a passing thing. He knew this woman and he were going to get together. She saw him. He saw her. He thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. That's what prostitutes did. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you?" She asked. "Well, I'll send you a young goat from my flock." "Well, will you give me something as a pledge until you send me that young goat? Can I have a down payment? Can I have a security deposit?" He said, "Well, what pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. The head of a family would wear a ring around his neck, usually accompanied by some sort of scarlet rope. The ring was what we would call today a seal. It's like a notary seal. It had an emblem on it, and it identified that man as the head of that family. No one had that ring except the head of the family. It was his signet, the same signet that Pontius Pilate used when he sealed the tomb of Jesus. They put the wax seal over top of the rock, and the seal of Pontius Pilate was then inscribed into that wax, so that everyone knew when they were looking at that, Pilate sealed this. No one touched this tomb. Pilate sealed this. It was a legal seal, a legal document, if you will. He was bound by it. She had every right to take him to task if he did not fulfill the vow he took with her to give her that young goat as payment for his prostituting her. And so he does his thing, and he returns to the party. And being an honorable man, he returns home, picks out the goat, and sends his buffoon, Hira, to go and pay his prostitute debt. Now the story gets real interesting. Verse 20. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back, that's his ring, his signet, and his staff, to get those back from the woman, but he did not find her. Now, the reason he didn't find her is she's not a prostitute. She's now got the widow's clothes on, if you'll recall. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside this road at Enaiam?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute there." Judah then said, "Well, let her keep what she has, or we will become the laughing stock." Does that give you a little insight into the man's heart? He's more concerned about his reputation than he is about what he had done with this woman. "Let her keep what she has, or we'll become the laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. So she can keep the ring." He figured that any further search for this alleged prostitute would draw attention to what he had done, that he, being a Jew, bound by the word not to have these kinds of relationships, had an intimate sexual relationship and paid for it with a prostitute. More concerned with his reputation than he was with the shame of his sin. He raised one son, who was a gangster and an embarrassment to his family. He raised another son, Onan, who refused to honor his family by assuming the law of the Levirate. He lost his wife and is now a widower and found himself a lonely, desperate old man with one son left. And he superstitiously concluded that this woman was a black widow and that there was no way under the sun he was going to give his third son to this woman. Verse 24, the drama continues. About 3 months later, give you a clue, 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law," notice what she's still called, "your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution. And as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Bring her out so that we can burn her to death. Now, the actual penalty for her sin was stoning. But if you had committed this act as a member of a priestly family, the head of that priestly family could insist on a greater penalty called burning. So he, in essence, is saying, she has disgraced us. I'm not going to let her die the easy death of stoning. I want her dead. And I want her dead in smoke. I want her dead in flames. Burn her to death. Verse 26, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize this blue dress." That'll take you a minute to get there. She was legally still a part of his family, and he had full rights over her life. But if she proved to be a prostitute, all of this was out. He could have her burned, he could be done with her, and it was time for her to produce her blue dress. And he had full rights over her life. But if she proved to be a prostitute, all of this was out. He could have her burned, he could be done with her, and it was time for her to produce her blue dress. Verse 26, Judah recognized them. Can you imagine how his breath must have been taken away? Here is a pregnant woman standing in front of him who has been accused of being a prostitute, a woman that he would have been very happy never to see again. And now he realizes he is the father of what she bears in her womb. She is the one I prostituted myself with. She, he says, is more righteous than I. You better believe it, Judah. Since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. Now, I've got to tell you something, friends. This act on her part has been debated by scholars as to whether or not she was right or wrong in prostituting herself and committing this act of incest with her father-in-law, Judah. And the debate goes back and forth. On the one side, we're dealing with incest. We're dealing with prostitution. There's no way we can justify that kind of behavior in Scripture. So on the one hand, you have to look at her and say what she did was wrong. But on the other hand, when you look at the motivation behind what she did, even though she could have done it a different way, the motivation behind what she did was she knew that the preservation of the line of Judah was at stake.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Thursday on the In His Grip podcast.